My parents divorced when I entered college. By the time I was old enough to understand, their relationship had already cooled down, and I spent my childhood pretending to be part of a fake family. My father, who was popular with women, married my mother because I was born. He often said that if I hadn't been born, he wouldn't have married her, and he didn't even try to hide his infidelity. On the other hand, my mother, who was pregnant with me, was forced to drop out of college by her grandparents and was forced to become a housewife. She resented this and cried every time my father cheated on her, but she wouldn't let me get close to her. As a result, I grew up as a cold child, so when my father and mother divorced, I thought it was a good thing. I explained that if I could get the tuition and half of the living expenses for my 4 years of college at once, I would be independent from then on. My father went to his new wife and children. My mother went abroad. Now I live with my husband, who is 4 years older than me, and my 3-year-old daughter. My husband was originally my senior at the same company. For me, who had a bad past, I expected that my relationship with him would not last long. However, he tried to date me as an equal, and I felt like I understood the feeling of liking someone for the first time. When he proposed, I was happy, but I was more scared. However, my in-laws quickly dispelled my worries. My in-laws are my parents-in-law and my sister-in-law of the same age as me. My father-in-law is a stepfather to my husband. If I tell them that there is a low possibility that both of my parents will attend the wedding even if I get married, and that I am estranged from both sides of my relatives. My father-in-law said, "Well, then I can walk down the Virgin Road with you." And he laughed off. My mother-in-law also said, "I don't care about the form, what's important to me is whether my son will be happy or not." So, he and I got married. Our daughter was born in the 3rd year of our marriage. During that time, my husband changed jobs once and started a business with a friend of my sister-in-law's. Now, he is busy every day as a co-representative of a travel company. At the recommendation of my parents-in-law, I help with the accounting of the company run by my father-in-law. It is a company that my father-in-law and his ex-wife started, but she passed away due to illness. My childless father-in-law devoted himself to running the company as a memento of his wife. Now, it has grown to the point where it has its own building in New York. As a relative of the president, I work hard without relying on him. My father-in-law advised me that it was tough from starting up the company to getting it on track. So, I do everything at home and say to my husband, "We're okay, so take care of your body." Then, my husband said, "Sorry. I'll take care of my body too." The company grew rapidly. Since then, my husband's return home has only been delayed. Until then, we used to go to my parents-in-law's house together once a month, but we hardly go there anymore. I think we should go there even a little because we found out that my mother-in-law is seriously ill. After her husband and my sister-in-law's father died in an accident, my mother-in-law raised her children alone and ran a restaurant. After that, she remarried my father-in-law. My mother-in-law chose palliative care immediately. My father-in-law persuaded her, "Don't give up on surgery." However, in the end, she said, "Please let me decide how to use my remaining time." I reported it to my husband, but he just said, "If mom decided, neither my sister nor I have the right to interfere." I thought he was respecting my mother-in-law's wishes, but my husband began to be reluctant to visit my mother-in-law who was receiving home care. He was also easily swayed by my sister-in-law. Every time I visit my parents-in-law with my daughter, my mother-in-law glances behind us to see if my husband is coming. It hurts me. My father-in-law also looks painful. And when my daughter innocently says, "Daddy hasn't played with me lately," my mother-in-law says a little sadly, "Yes, he's a bad dad." I have to scold him a lot when I see him next time. I also feel sad. One late night, my father-in-law contacted me to say that my mother-in-law's condition had suddenly worsened and she had been taken to the hospital by ambulance. I quickly woke up my daughter and emailed my husband, but he didn't reply. Even when I rushed to the hospital by taxi, only my father-in-law was there. I wondered why this was happening at this time, but even when I called the company, it was on the answering machine, and my anxiety only increased. Soon after, the doctor told us that my mother-in-law had passed away. Then, I returned to my parents-in-law's house with my mother-in-law. About 2 hours later, my husband and sister-in-law rushed in. At that time, many employees from my father-in-law's company had come to help and offer condolences, and they all looked coldly at my husband, who had messy hair and was clearly hungover, and my sister-in-law, who was wearing a flashy dress. I don't even feel like talking to them. Then, the two of them made excuses, but my angry father-in-law said, "That's enough. I don't want to shout in front of my wife. Shut up." They were scared by his cold words and the looks of those around him and huddled in the corner of the room. It seems that my mother-in-law had been discussing the details of her funeral with a friendly funeral home for some time. It seems that the news of her death had reached many people who mourned her, and many people attended the funeral. Even during that time, my husband and sister-in-law just sat there and didn't seem to care about the looks of those around them. 10 days after the funeral, I received an express delivery on my day off. The sender was a law firm. Inside was a sealed letter and an envelope with the name of the law firm. The envelope contained a letter from my mother-in-law, who had asked to send it to me after about 10 days had passed since her death. She had entrusted the letter to the law firm. She wrote that I should read it so that her children would not notice it, and then wrote an address. I took the key that was enclosed and hurried to the address designated for my daughter and me. What I saw there was beyond my expectations. After that, my husband, sister-in-law, my daughter, and I were told by my father-in-law to come to his house. We sat on the living room sofa. Then, my father-in-law called and there was a knock on the door. 2 men in suits entered the living room. My husband and sister-in-law looked suspiciously at the men, but their faces lit up when they were handed a business card from the law firm. The 2 lawyers turned to all of us and said, "We will now read the will of the deceased. I would like to inform you in advance that this will is a legally valid will." After that, they read the will. My mother-in-law's property was the ownership of the building and restaurant that she bought and built, as well as savings, but the savings were given to my father-in-law, and the remaining ownership of the building and restaurant, as well as a life insurance policy of $100,000, were to be given to my husband and sister-in-law. The amount of savings was about $200,000, but the real estate value of the building would far exceed that. Originally, the inheritance rights were divided equally between my father-in-law and my husband and sister-in-law, but my husband and sister-in-law looked at my father-in-law with a flicker of their eyes. My father-in-law said, "I have no objection to that." They signed the inheritance division agreement with a relieved expression. Then, we talked about the distribution of other personal belongings of my mother-in-law. My sister-in-law, who was excited about getting the building, said, "What? Mother's personal belongings? That's antiques and so on, right? I don't need those old-fashioned things." So I said, "May I have them? I want to pass them down to my daughter as a memento of her." She agreed. Furthermore, I had a consent form prepared by the lawyer to allow me, a third party, to receive the personal belongings, and I got the signatures of the 3 members of my family. My husband and sister-in-law laughed and said it was exaggerated, but I stopped them from leaving and handed the divorce papers to my husband. "I never thought you would ask for a divorce here and now. You have been making excuses for work and having an affair with your sister's friend who is a co-entrepreneur. I have evidence that I have secured through a private investigation company. My request is for custody of our daughter, alimony, and a lump sum payment of child support. I don't need any property division." I handed him a list of the calculated amounts of alimony and child support and the divorce agreement that I had prepared with the help of a lawyer. Suddenly, my husband said, "What? If you knew, I didn't have to put on an act." He laughed. My sister-in-law also said, "You're right. You're surprisingly wicked." I was also quite busy carrying the burden of my brother's affair. The 2 of them kept laughing. I ignored them and signed the papers when prompted by the lawyer. He promised to transfer the money tomorrow. I told my husband that the important items among the apartment's belongings had already been moved to another location and that he could dispose of the remaining items when I vacated the room. I then asked, "I have custody of our daughter, but what about visitation rights?" My husband replied, "I don't need to hide it anymore. My child will be born over there soon. So, is it okay for our daughter to say goodbye here with a smirk?" I was about to explode with anger, but my father-in-law calmly said, "Then, it would be better to add that as an additional item in the agreement and get a signature." I followed his advice. My husband and sister-in-law tried to leave. My husband said, "Well, listen to your mother and take care of yourself." He waved his hand and left without looking back. My father-in-law patted my head as I hugged my daughter, who looked puzzled. After that, I confirmed that the promised compensation and child support had been deposited and submitted the divorce papers. I tried to rent a room for me and my daughter to live in, but my father-in-law said, "We have no legal relationship, but would you like to live here together? You won't have to pay rent." It's true that if we live here, the stress on my daughter and the change in environment will be minimized. However, I was hesitant to rely on him so much, but I agreed to take care of the housework in exchange for the rent. My daughter is happy to live with her beloved grandpa, and my father-in-law is also smiling, saying, "My wife must be happy somewhere." I can hear my grandchild's laughter in this house. I do feel her presence and feel protected here. On the other hand, my ex-husband and ex-sister-in-law sold the ownership of the store to the person in charge of each store and were looking forward to changing the name of the building. However, when they actually went through the procedure, they found out that a kind of mortgage had been set on that building, and that my late mother-in-law had raised funds for business expansion. Furthermore, it turned out that the current debtor of that building was not the original bank, but a finance company with many suspicious rumors, and that my mother-in-law had been delaying repayment for about 6 months before her death. If they want to sell the building as planned, they will have to negotiate with the finance company on how and when to repay the remaining debt, and go through complicated procedures. In addition, the travel company, which seemed to be going well, was actually in the red due to the loose financial sense of my ex-husband and his executives, so they couldn't raise such funds. As a result, incidents, fraudsters, and land developers disguised as financial companies that flocked to financial companies and real estate that seemed to be profitable, they lost the rights to the building, and the travel company went bankrupt. He was also abandoned by their affair partners, and the $100,000 from my mother-in-law's life insurance disappeared immediately as a lump sum payment for compensation and child support, and as repayment for borrowed money. Well, they still have debt, so it's negative. 2 people who had fallen into despair and were not accepted by anyone came to this house to cling to me and my father-in-law. However, my father-in-law said, "Your relationship with me was cut off when my wife died. It doesn't matter, don't come again." When I said the same thing. "I divorced you, so you are a stranger. You have no use, because you gave up visitation rights." They looked hopeless. Nevertheless, my ex-sister-in-law persisted. "Then return the memento that ma'am gave you at that time. I can get some money by selling it." I told them to take them as they wished when I brought them. They both started to carry them with a different look in their eyes. At that time, I also showed them the notebook that my mother-in-law had left behind. "I don't need such a thing," she said, and left with my mother-in-law's memento. Actually, the most valuable thing that my mother-in-law left behind was this notebook. Following the memo in the notebook, I went to a place and found a trunk room. When I opened the room with the key in the notebook, there was a small suitcase, and inside it was evidence of my ex-husband's affair that I had investigated by a private investigation company and a long letter. My mother-in-law seemed to have realized that my ex-husband and ex-sister-in-law's business was fragile and that one of the causes was his affair. And when she realized that her life was not long, she was most concerned about the future of me and my daughter, who had no one to rely on. I can't forgive the betrayal of the children I raised so hard. My late husband, the father of my sons, repeated his infidelity during his lifetime, and I cried about it many times. The children who should have known that will do the same thing as their real father. My mother-in-law, who wrote that, wanted to pass on the inheritance to me and my daughter without any trouble after her death, and at the same time, set up a mortgage with a notorious finance company to get back at her children. She seems to have intentionally delayed the repayment of the money raised by the mortgage on the building. I thought about depositing this letter in a bank safe deposit box, but there is a risk of freezing it as soon as I die, and my children may find it at that time. I'm glad you're reading this notebook. And I hope you and my grandchild will live happily. I couldn't stop crying after reading the letter that ended with that. I showed the letter to my father-in-law, but my mother-in-law had apparently arranged for the same letter to be sent to my father-in-law. Knowing everything, my father-in-law decided to participate in the plan for my mother-in-law, and we accomplished everything according to the plot she drew. While greeting my mother-in-law's photo with my daughter, I spoke to her in my heart. "Mother-in-law, you are an irreplaceable mother-in-law to me forever." My father-in-law's eyes were also moist. While looking back at my mother-in-law's photo again, I said in a loud voice this time, "I'm off. Hurry up or you'll be late," he said. My eyes were also moist.